a brief history about the Turkish people and their contribution to Islam. Before we get into the Islamic contribution, I wanted to discuss a bit about what they were and where they came from pre-Islam as well. As we know, the Turks are well known for being a martial race, and for over 1,000 years they have predominantly been a Muslim people and have contributed to Islam in Asia, in Europe, and also in Africa and beyond. Early Islamic works, based predominantly on the Israiliyat, the Jewish sources, as you know, many of the stories of the prophets have been influenced by the Israiliyat sources. And from them, many of the classical scholars mention that the Turks descend from the prophet Nuh, alayhi salam, Noah, through his son. He had three sons, Sam, Ham, and Yafet. Yafet being the ancestor of the Turks. From Yafet, from some of the sources, they say that his grandchild was a man called Turk. And it is from his progeny that we have the Turkish people. From among the ancient Turks that in pre-modern Islam, there was a great leader called Oğuz Kağan, from which many of the famous Turkish communities, including that of Turkey, Cyprus, Turkmenistan, all stem their heritage from this Oğuz Kağan. He was a great leader, and although it was pre-Islam, the sources indicate many of the characteristics of prophethood. He called to true monotheism, to the true religion of one God. In fact, he expelled the Mongols to a faraway land because they did not convert to the religion of monotheism. Some of the scholars, particularly the more classical scholars, have said that he may have been a prophet, or even some who think that he has the characteristics of Zulkarnain. And if we look on the banknotes of Turkmenistan, they have a depiction of Oğuz Kağan with two horns, representing that they assume that he may be Zulkarnain, and other ones regarding that. At that time, the Turks were living in Central Asia, in what is now Mongolia. They were a hardy nomadic people. Physically, they looked very different from what we may assume that the typical Turk to look like. The Middle Eastern Turk from Anatolia, for example, looks very different from those original proto-Turks. In fact, our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, although he was in the Middle East, far away from Central Asia, he gives a very accurate description of the Turks of the time, which is found in the Sahih aḥadis as well. The Prophet ﷺ, he says that the Turks have faces like hammered shields, meaning that they have a flat face, small eyes, to try and think about the Mongoloid eyes, or the kind of eyes that we typically resemble the people of Chinatown, for example. They have red faces and flat noses, and they wear clothes and shoes made of hair. And we know that this is an accurate description through historical sources and imagery. There are even statues found in Central Asia depicting those ancient proto-Turks, which accurately resembles the description of our Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet also advised Muslims, leave the Turks alone, as long as they leave you alone. It is around the year 300 of Hijrah in which Seljuks Khan converts to Islam, and he adopts the name Abdul Karim. He would eventually become the leader of the Turkish Karahanid Khanate, a Khan of which many of our Asian brothers also have the same surname, Khan meaning king. The Khanate is basically a kingdom. Abdul Karim Seljuks became the Khan of this Karahanid state. And it was through the adoption of the kings to Islam in which eventually not only tens of thousands but hundreds of thousands of Turks converted from their shamanistic, what they call Tanrıism, Tanrı meaning God, in which many of them even found resemblances between their Tanrı belief and that of Islam. Things like monotheism. The Turks, being a martial race, were very impressed with the idea of jihad and being a Ghazi, with their idea of being Akıncı, raiders. As a result of this adoption to Islam at the state level, we have a scholar who is known as Mahmud Kashgari. Kashgari is currently East Turkestan, which is the occupied Xinjiang, which means New Frontier, in China. And we pray that our brothers there, around 30 million of which will gain their freedom soon. Mahmud Kashgari wrote an encyclopedic work in Arabic called the Diwan Turk. And this work explains and introduces the Turks, their languages, their tribes, to the Arabs. The aim of which was not only to familiarize the Arabs with their new converted brothers, and advise the Arabs that they should learn Turkish, for the reason that the Turks would have dominion for a very long time. But he was correct in his prediction. Within a very short time, many of these Turks enlisted the Abbasid armies. Some of them willingly, some of them as captured slaves. There were Turks who were captured by the Muslim Turks. And there is a hadith in which there are people that will be taken to Jannah, to heaven, in chains. So it may be that these people who were taken as slaves initially, and who would be at the service of the caliphate, it may be that they are also blessed, that they initially came to the service of Islam through these chains. Very soon, however, what eventually happened is that the Abbasid Caliphate started to decay. And as a result of this, many Turkish Muslim states started to appear. One of these are the Seljuks, and at their peak, their dominion was from Turkmenistan in Central Asia all the way to Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. Although they had this power, they were still very loyal to the Abbasid Caliph and used their power to serve Ahlul Sunnah and Orthodox Islam. At the time, there was a major threat from the Shia. Externally, that being of the Fatimids, who started in North Africa and were expanding at such a rate that they were a real threat to Sunni Islam. This threat extended internally as well. There was the Batiniya, who are an Ismaili sect of Shia Islam. In English, they are commonly known as the assassins for their formidable use of assassination, even at the risk or the peril of their own lives. It would be no exaggeration to state that the continued domination of Ahlul Sunnah owes much to the Seljuks. When they started to disintegrate, they became small Turkmen, Turkmen being a word for the Oğuz Turks. They became small Turkmen states known as Beyliks, the Bey being the chief or the emir of these states. Now these Beyliks play a critical role in the resistance of the Muslims against the Western invaders during the Crusades. The most obvious example that comes to mind is that of Zengids and the Zengids. However, these Oğuz Turks, these Turkmens, were not the only ones to contribute in the defense of Islam. In Egypt, for example, there was a great demand for Turkish slaves from the Caucasus, which eventually led to the dominance of these slaves, who were called Mamluk. Mamluk is an Arabic word for slave. However, it was not slavery in the sense of this chattel slavery, in which we see the transatlantic slave trade. No, these slaves were honored. They were emirs. They were given high posts, and because of their martial skills, particularly on the horseback, they rose very fast in power, eventually taking control of the governorship of Egypt. They were the Seljuk Turks who ruled Egypt. And the Mamluks, meaning slave, as I mentioned, is a modern term, which we use not only in English but also in Arabic. They, for themselves, in their primary sources, if we look at Tariq, for example, the famous Mamluk historian of the time, he mentioned that their kings were known as the Muluk al-Turk, the Turkish kings, and that the state, the Mamluk state, was known as Ad-Dawla Turkiya, which translates to the state of Turkey. I find this very interesting because when we think of Turkey now, we think of Anatolia. From the primary source, we know that Egypt was in fact the first place to be known as Turkey. In fact, the only other state that we have reference prior to that in the name Turk is that of the Seljuks, the pre-Islamic era. These Mamluks were critical against the Crusaders. We have, for example, Sultan Balasai, who captured the Frankish kingdom of Cyprus and took their king prisoner to Cairo in chains, after which this Frankish Latin Crusader kingdom became subservient to the Muslims of Egypt. Perhaps the biggest and the most destructive threat that the Muslims have ever faced in their 1400-year history is that of the Mongols, who killed hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of Muslims, in which the skulls of these Muslims was piled up into pyramids. The great library of Baghdad was destroyed, and all the books of which were thrown into the river, and the river was turned black because of the ink that leaked into the river. The only ones to stop their expansion was the Mamluks at the Battle of Zengids, which was led by Kutuz and Beyliks. And their names are Proto-Turkish names. Earlier I mentioned the Turkmen and Beyliks, the most famous of which, from which we have many. For example, the Karaman Beylik, the Akkoyunlular, Karakoyunlular, the Black Sheep, the White Sheep, for example. However, the most obvious, most important of which was that of the Beylik of Osman and the Osman people, that being the Ottomans. They accomplished an empire which spread across 3 continents. They accomplished the prediction of the Prophet ﷺ with the conquest of Constantinople, today Istanbul, which also is significant for secular historians because it's what led to the early modern era by Fatih Sultan Muhammad II. They also spread into the Balkans, what they called Romania, modern-day Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, Albania, Macedonia, Bosnia, the Balkans, for many hundreds of years, from which statistics tell us 50% was Muslim. Many of those Muslims were killed by the Orthodox during their nationalistic uprisings. However, the contribution and the influence of the Ottoman Turks is still very evident, with our brothers the Bosniaks and the Albanians, who have played a very vital role in Islam. Many of the viziers have come from the Albanians and the Bosniaks. The Albanians were very much known, just as they are saying, to be strong, who were the service of Islam. And many of the Turkish habits and influence is evident with these people as well. For example, in Bosnia, if you go there, they will use many Turkish words, even Persian words, which the Turks had adopted. For example, instead of salah, for prayer, they will say namaz, aḥadis, oruç, which are all words of Farsi origin, was borrowed by the Turks, and from there also went on to the brothers and sisters in the Balkans. The Ottomans were also in North Africa and played an important and critical role in slowing down the expansion of the French and Spanish to those areas. In fact, we know that the intention of the Ottomans was not just for wealthy power, because they sent military aid to lands way beyond that of their territory. We have records from the time even of Sultan Selim II, from the 1500s, in which the Ottomans sent military support to the Muslims in Spain. At that time, Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, had been completely overtaken by the Christians. And the Muslims at the time were under immense pressure either to accept Christianity or to flee to the Muslim lands. The Muslim Ottomans had also sent military support to Gujarat in current-day India, because there were the Portuguese who were trying to expand in those areas as well. The Muslim Ottomans had also sent military aid to Aceh in current-day Indonesia. This Jundullah spirit, this spirit of being the warriors of Allah for the Ummah, continues to the modern era. During the Great War, that being the First World War, the motivation of the Turkish participation in the Great War was, as a Turkish poet of Cyprus, Kaytazzade Nazım Efendi, wrote in 1916, İlahi dinü devlet içindir cihadımız. It is to raise the level of the religion and the state that we are participating in this jihad. Interestingly, this Kaytazzade Nazım Efendi is the grandfather of Sheikh Nazım Kubrisi. The current Turkish army is now lovingly by the Turks, even the secular Turks, by all aspects of Turkish society, as Mehmetçik. Mehmet is a very common Turkish name. What many of you may not be aware of is Mehmet is short for Muhammad. And this was not out of a way to just shorten the name, it was done out of respect for the Prophet. They felt that they were not deserving to be on the same level as our Prophet, and hence why Mehmet was preferred to be used for those named Muhammad. This army being nicknamed Mehmetçik, and thus the army of Muhammad. In fact, the Turkish Republic, the modern-day Turkish Republic, was the first Muslim state to successfully, in the 20th century, post-World War eras, was the first Muslim country to go beyond its borders to save Muslim unity. In 1974, the Turkish army went to Cyprus to intervene, to protect the Turkish Muslims of Cyprus from the Orthodox Greeks in their ambition for enosis, for union with Greece. And as I mentioned earlier, in the Balkans, in Greece, in Crete, there were many Turks and Muslims. If we look at the case of Crete, for example, there is not a single Cretan Muslim left. And so, in 1974, what the Turkish army did was very significant. And from there on, we see campaigns in Bosnia, in Syria to the modern era, and many other campaigns. And we see similarity in what Pakistan is doing in Kashmir, for example. It is all a result of the success which started in 1974. The Turkish contribution, however, to Islam goes way beyond militaristic campaigns. There are cultural contributions. If we think of what is the symbol of Islam, we think of the moon and sun as the most obvious symbol. This mainstream adoption of the moon and star was influenced primarily by the Turks, particularly the Ottoman Turks. The moon and star for the Turks symbolizes the Shahada. The crescent, which is called the Hilal, which is also Arabic, has the same letters in it as the word Allah. A symbolic way to display Islam in a way that can also be used by the non-Muslims, for example. The architecture, the beautiful architecture of the Turks, particularly that of the Ottoman period, is very famous. The most obvious example being that of their mosques, with the pencil-like minarets, decorated with porcelain tiles from Iznik and Kütahya. The calligraphy of the world famous Khattab calligraphers, who to this day, although the Turks have adopted the Latin scripts, they still have master calligraphers in Arabic scripts, who teach and give ijazat licenses in many of the styles, such as Nastaliq, Rika, and Fuluf. Coffee, which has become very popular of late, which spread from Ethiopia and Yemen. However, upon reaching Istanbul, gained the style of making coffee which is known as Turkish coffee, which was made during the Ottoman Empire, and hence why it is called Turk. And remember, at this time, the Turk, the name or title of Turk, was also synonymous with the title of Muslim. A Turk was a Muslim, a Muslim was a Turk. This Turkish coffee was used by the scholars and the dervishes of the time to study and write and pray till late hours. Although there was a fatwa given at the time saying that it was haram. Kebab, döner for example, the Turkish word, döner means to spin, to turn. Yogurt, which came from Central Asia. Ayran, the yogurt drink. In fact, other contributions, such as the earliest Quran translations in English, one of which was written by Mehdi Sadr, a Turk from Cyprus. And finally, I can see that our audience is predominantly from South Asia. The Turks have done much to contribute to the influence of Islam in the subcontinent. In fact, many of you here today may not have been Muslim had it not been for the Turkish sultanates that were there, some of which include the Ghaznavi, the Delhi Sultanate of Sultan Aybek, Turk, Tarkan, the Timurids, the Mughals, which came from Babu Shah. Even the language that is spoken as a lingua franca among Muslims of South Asia, Urdu, stems from the Turkish word Urdu, which means army. Because much of these Turks that came were soldiers. Many Turkish words, particularly that of the Chagatai dialect, are still used today in Urdu and I'm sure in many of the other South Asian languages, such as Bengali. Words such as Baji, Arslan, Barlas, Hanum, Kapun, and so on are all Proto-Turkish words. And I hope that this will be a sufficient, brief summary of the Turkish history and contribution to Islam. And I'd like to wrap up there